going to kick this off. I'd like to welcome everybody to this special track session of the AAEA. This session is focused on fraudulent pesticides in West Africa. This is an emerging issue of high significance for not only West Africa, but the whole continent. And I think after this session, you'll appreciate why. So our aim here is to raise your awareness of what we think is an emerging, fundamentally important issue affecting food security on the African continent. We have two presentations rather than three. Our third presentation has fallen victim to the COVID outbreak. So I'm going to kick off and provide an overview of the evolution of pesticide use in the region and the emergence of large-scale emergence of fraudulent activity. We'll talk about why that's a problem and what are the policy reactions and responses required to get a handle on this. Because if we fail to get a handle on it, the downside consequences are severe. Oh, hi, Ellen. We're going to get started. As I said, we have two presentations, and I'm going to kick off and give you an overview, and then I'll show you how Véronique Thériault, my colleague, is going to come in afterwards and focus in on some of the most serious risks that we're seeing as a result of this explosive growth of pesticide use and the even greater explosion in use of frauds. So here I'm going to start sharing my screen. If anybody has trouble seeing this, please let me know. We'll keep an eye on the chat box if there are any questions. Our intention is to take about 45 minutes or so with the presentations and leave 45 for questioning and comments at the end. But if something urgent emerges, please drop a note in the chat box and we'll take a look. And Vero, I'll ask you while I'm presenting, if you see something that I urgently need to address during the presentation, please let me know. And I'll do the same for you. I'll be your, I'll ride shotgun when you are presenting. So here is, let's see. So can you see this, Vero?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, so I want to talk about fraudulent pesticides, and if you've been living in ignorance, this is your big day, because we're going to provide you some empirical evidence. We've had teams working on this for about the last 5 years, market studies and farm studies in 7 different West African countries. And so what I'm presenting here summarizes a dozen or dozen and a half publications and empirical studies. 4 themes I'm going to go over with you. First one has to do with the growing markets. And this really gives you a sense for the scale of what's going on. We've had a literal explosion in pesticide use since the early 2000s. This looks just like the COVID graphs that you see around the world. And what's driving that has been herbicides, an enormous explosion in herbicide uptake for a couple of reasons. Really, 3 things driving this initial surge. First is patent protection expiring. Roundup, you've probably all heard of, Monsanto's trade name for glyphosate, went off patent late in the year 2000. And as that patent restriction lapsed, series of Asian producers launched into very large scale production of glyphosate, and we've seen an enormous proliferation in the number of generic herbicides worldwide, really. I'll show you some pictures from West Africa. What's really driving the volumes here is, as I said, the herbicides. And so you've had two things going on. You've had the cost of herbicides has fallen roughly by 50% over the last decade because of these generics. On the other hand, you've got rapid urbanization, you've got gold mining in a lot of parts of West Africa. You've got labor shortages on the farm and rising wage rates. Well, when you have rising wage rates and falling herbicide costs, it's obvious that herbicide use becomes much more profitable. And so that's really what's driven this first wave. And I just want to backtrack 1 second to show you. Glyphosate goes off patent, you see this explosion of mostly herbicide use, and it's leveled off around the middle of the decade here. Once the data get up to date, what we're seeing now in the markets is a second wave of growth, started about 2017 or 18. And this coming wave, the current wave, is not herbicides, but insecticides. We have a series of insect invasions in Africa. You've got the locusts in East Africa, of course, but you've got the fall armyworm that's attacking maize crops throughout Africa from about 2016 on. And we have no approved active ingredients for the fall armyworm. So farmers are putting any poison they can on there, cotton insecticides, lettuce, whatever they've got, they're pouring on. And so we've had this first wave and then a leveling off, but we're at the beginning now of a second big wave. And the second wave, the current wave, is far more dangerous than the first one because these insecticides are a very high mammalian tox. This is an extremely dangerous phenomenon that we're witnessing. Now, a couple things happen when you get, we're looking backwards for the moment at this first wave and what happened during this surge in the 2000s. When you've got markets growing exponentially, you get a lot of interest commercially. And every market we looked at, we sent teams in 7 different countries, and the commercial interest is enormous. Here you see the number of registered traders. Just look at Guinea. This is a tiny country. Only 2 importers in 2000. By 2016, there were over 20 of them, a 10-fold increase. You see this among importers, retailers, applicators, and this is simply the registered traders. There are a whole lot more that are not registered at all. Here's a bicycle repair shop in western Mali along the Guinea border, and this young entrepreneur discovered that early in the rainy season, he could sell a lot of money. He could make quick money by selling. He's got insecticides there in his middle rack with the pink labels, and the bottom row is all herbicides. This is really important because these traders, he knows something about repairing bicycles, but if you ask him about dosages and application rates and timing and safety precautions, this particular retailer can't tell you very much. Growth and a lot of non-technical people involved in selling what can be potentially very dangerous products. Now, you've got new traders, but also an explosion in the number of brands, and I just want to show you how this marketing works. On the left side, you've got Monsanto's Roundup. These are all samples of glyphosate. There are hundreds of different generic brands out in the market, but what you can see is this classic green and white packaging of Roundup, and the first wave of generics imitated that. In fact, if you look here, this little one from Guinea, it's a little hard to read this. Name brand of this glyphosate is called Rundupe. So a very transparent effort to imitate the well-known Roundup. In West Africa, these are also glyphosate. Every one of these claims to have 360 grams per liter of glyphosate in them, same as these. Now, these are the red berets. And again, this is Guinea, of all places, is the big innovator. An Indian firm selling to Guinea decided that for marketing purposes in Francophone world, if you have a thorny problem, if the terrorists take over the Eiffel Tower, call on the Red Berets. The Red Berets are the elite special forces of the French military. And if you're a farmer in West Africa and you've got a pest in your fields, the idea of bringing in the Red Berets is highly appealing. And this has been a fantastically successful marketing tool. And today, the Red Berets, Glycel here, this Ghanaian brand on the left was the first. But just take a look at the others that have imitated that packaging. Just to show you the difficulty farmers face. And this is how we got into this. Our teams go out and work with farmers, and they were complaining. There were 50 different brands in the market, which ones were good. And you can see on the left, the Roundup and the Glyphorce, which is an unregistered generic, deliberate attempt to imitate the Roundup marketing. The one on the right is even more insidious. Glycel is the original Red Beret from coming out of Guinea. And here you've got a cheap counterfeit. And the only difference here, Glycel, and if you look closely, you can sell the Glycet here. They used the same photo, duped over, and it's a little more faded, but just a deliberate copy. So the farmer, again, is trying to figure out which of these to buy. Here's another example. Glyphadare is currently the best-selling brand in the entire region. Glyphadare, and take a look at the one on the right, Glyphadare. They changed one letter, but everything else, even the little cartoon sprayer is the same. Here is something you see a fair amount where you've got an insecticide, and here you've got an authorized sample, and the one on the right is so beat up and this top looks so used, we suspect that this one is likely been tampered with. So we don't really know what's in the bottle. They're trying to pass this off as an insecticide, but who knows what's inside. So against this explosion of volumes, you've got pretty much no change in regulatory staffing or budgets, and the regulators are simply overwhelmed. They cannot keep track of what's going on. And so there's a lot of product out on the market. They simply don't have the resources to track it down. And hence the emergence of the frauds. And not going to go into too much detail here, but just to say the ballpark number, this is highly, highly variable. But we think that roughly a third of all of the pesticides used in West Africa are fraudulent, about a third. We think around quarter, 27% or so are simply these unregistered generics that I showed you. And a much smaller number are actual counterfeits, where they try to pass it off as the real thing. Turns out you don't have to do that. You can get an unregistered generic on the market very easily. So ballpark number 1/3. We've actually invested some time trying to see if that's about right. I can send you the documents here. I won't go into too much detail, except to say we sampled markets, we sampled retailers, we picked formal and informal retailers, we picked permanent markets and weekly markets, and we interviewed traders. We took a photo of every single that they were selling and then went back to our office to determine which were registered and which were not. And the bottom line here is that a little over a fourth were unregistered. And that's true of herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. Really across all pesticide categories, you find these unregistered products. So this 26%, just to go back, really pretty much in line with what we were expecting based on the regional averages. The other finding that I think is probably not too surprising to you is that the informal traders tend to have more of the unregistered products, about 30%. Whereas the formal are less, but not zero. So even if you're buying from a reputable licensed dealer, you will risk having to decide between an unregistered and a registered product. Here, just to give you a feel for the farmer's difficulty here, if he goes out to send his nephew to buy glyphosate, there are 59 different brands to choose from. If he's looking for nickel sulfurion 22, the farmer has lots of choices and not much information on which to make his choices. And they're quite worried, and that's why we got into this, was to find out on behalf of the farmer, well, what's in all these different bottles and which brands are trustworthy? And so to do that, we did some lab testing on glyphosate samples. It's the most widely sold pesticide globally and also in West Africa. So we went through, and again, we had a sampling protocol, ended up with 100 samples, and would have to be a chemist here. Here's an array of the range of samples we selected. Everyone came from a bottle that promised 360 grams per liter of active ingredient glyphosate. So you can look for yourself here at this photo and tell me, do you think that's the same thing in all those bottles? Well, we went out to have this tested, and here, after years of social science research, I thought finally I got to do some hard science, and was disappointed to learn that hard science is not so precise after all. We had very serious problems of precision from these different testing laboratories. One from West Africa, 2 of these labs are from the USA. We ended up shipping samples to the US because we were so worried. We started at lab number 1 and we said, boy, something's wrong. As you can see, two of our blind duplicates differed by over 20%. The lab was testing product from the exact same bottle under different submission numbers, should have been identical, and they were far off. So 3 out of 10 of the blind duplicates were unusable from lab 1. Lab 2 did the best, but look at lab 3. 6 out of 10 were completely unreasonable results, unusable. So we ended up using the results from lab 2, and I'll just show you quickly what we found out. But I want to point this out because labs are expensive to run, and even good labs, these are all highly recommended labs, and we're protect their names here. But you as a researcher have to be extremely careful, and I would urge you, if you get into any of this formulation testing, always include a set of blind duplicates in your submissions. That's your only protection against incompetent slipshod lab work, because these labs were all well equipped and well staffed, and some of them had interns working. There were a number of problems, and if you want to use the results, if you want to have faith in them, you need to submit the blind duplicates. So this lab testing is a serious issue. So looking at the results from lab 2, the bottom line here is that the fraudulent products are of lower dosage. Ballpark roughly around 10% lower level of active ingredient than those that are registered. And this second circle here on the right is the one that I find really frightening. 35%, over a third of all of these fraudulent products had less than 75% of the promised active ingredients. This is massively advertised, given that level of underdosage. And that raises some very huge risks that we'll talk about in a second. And the reason that policymakers need to become very alarmed about this. To quickly summarize the empirical results, and then I'll go into the policy implications in a second. Volumes are growing rapidly, and the wave very toxic classes of insecticides. Fraud levels are also very high, but highly variable. And third finding is that the frauds are of lower quality. Now, this shouldn't be any surprise since they don't do the testing or the quality control. They just want to get it out the door quickly. So the farmer is facing very serious problem. And this is where you all come in, and we really need to get this out. Vero and I are working very closely with the regulators in different countries, because there are a lot of problems that emerge in this environment. If you're a farmer, this is disastrous, because you buy the product and it may work and it may not. If you're a consumer, this is a problem because nobody knows what's in these bottles. This part of the problem, Veronique is going to be talking about in a second. We did a systematic study to assess what do we think are the main human health risks emerging in this environment. There's a big risk faced, a reputational risk that the honest traders face. Because when a third of the market is taken up by frauds, that's eroding their market share. So it turns out the most active anti-fraud crusaders in the whole region are these honest traders. They become staunch allies. I think potentially the biggest risk here is an environmental risk. And think of antibiotics. In human medicine, if you're prescribed a course of antibiotics and you cut it short, that's a big problem, because it favors the emergence of resistance, new generations of superbugs that are resistant to your antibiotic. And the same thing happens with pesticides. If you've got a third of the products on the market are frauds, and if they're underdosed by 10% and some as much as 75%, then you've effectively got large-scale underdosage underway across the whole region, and The long-term danger is that we breed super weeds and super bugs that are resistant to the known active ingredients we have in our arsenal. So in terms of food security threats down the road, this is a massive potential train wreck waiting to happen. We really have to get a control on the quality of these products if we're going to avoid the emergence of super pests. Now the regulatory system, see how much time. Okay, I'm going to have to accelerate here, so I won't. I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly. I do want you to see the different stages in testing. It's important, and I'm going to use a COVID analogy here. Look at the 3 columns. If you're regulating pesticides, there are 3 phases. There's the pre-registration phase where you do all of your laboratory testing. This is where most of our COVID treatments and antivirals, vaccines they're in the testing phase. Once you've done your testing, you can go to column B. Step 2 is you go to the regulators and say, here's my proof. This active ingredient in these conditions will work. So the registration authorities decide yes or no to allow it. And then the 3rd stage is you've authorized a certain number of products on the market, and then somebody has to go out and enforce that and see, well, what are all these other 59 brands that we didn't register? Why are they on the market? And what's the dosage there? So there are 3 phases here, and there are lots of different models for doing this. The most common is a model on which individual countries have their own set of testing guidelines, their own registration body, and their own enforcement mechanism. I want to jump here to model 3, which is the most interesting model here. And this is the 9 Sahelian countries have been harmonizing since 1994, over 25 years. They have standardized their testing protocols, and they have a one-stop shop where anybody who wants to sell in these 9 Sahelian countries brings their testing results and said, we would like to be registered for sale. And they bring it to one place, and if it's a yes, then they can sell in all 9 countries. And this is a huge economy for the private companies. It's so huge for the reg because they don't all have labs, they don't all have PhD entomologists, they don't all have the toxicologists, but collectively, they have put together a very impressive and very professional group of scientists that monitor this regulatory process. And this is a very impressive group. Where the system falls down is in phase 3, in the post-registration monitoring. They've got, in most places, you've got pretty good testing protocols and pretty serious registration decision-making, but after that, you've got nothing. And part of the the difficulty is that you've got a variety. Who's in charge of enforcing these? Well, in some cases, it's the Ministry of Environment, some cases Ministry of Agriculture, in some cases Ministry of Health. Each one of those has quite different mandates and interests when they go out to enforce. All of them, incidentally, low budget and not much outreach capacity. So the weaknesses we find in the system at the pre-testing stage, the problem is that when you don't have harmonized registration requirements, then the private sector has to go, if there are 15 different countries, they have to do 15 different sets of tests. And that's very costly, and they don't want to do it, especially because some of these are small countries. And that's the interest in harmonizing registration testing requirements. It's even better if you can harmonize the second phase, the registration decision making, because when you don't, you end up with a problem like here. Ghana is currently the epicenter of fraudulent pesticides in West Africa. And these are the smuggling routes as traced by the private sector for us. And you can see what happens. You've got herbicides like paraquat and atrazine that are legal in Ghana. They're authorized for sale. They're illegal across the border in Ivory Coast, really in all the surrounding countries. And so what do you see as a result of that inconsistent decision? Boom, widespread smuggling of what's legal in Ghana into surrounding areas where it's not legal. Now, the weak link in all of the systems we've found is the post-registration monitoring enforcement. And that is a huge problem, leads to all the risks that I talked about before. There are things we can do, and Vero and a lot of our African colleagues are working very actively to do this. Regional harmonization is a big deal. It matters. The Sahelians have really done the best job of this, and every region in Africa is sending people to ask how they did it, because that really is very important, at least at the first two stages. The other bright spot here is the second bullet, the private sector engagement. As I said, the honest traders are the ones with the most to lose as these frauds proliferate. And they've really led the anti-counterfeiting efforts. They have big backers internationally. They're at risk of losing the entire market. And so they're the ones going to the regulators. Ironically, it's the regulated saying, you need to regulate us more to combat these frauds. And so the alliance, the natural alliance for fighting frauds is the honest traders, the farmer organizations, and the regulators. And those are the three groups that we've been working with. I think there's a lot of action. I think I've used up my time here. Basically, there's everybody needs to take this seriously. And on this call, I expect most of you are in category number 4. This is a fire as far as I'm concerned, if we don't really take some serious action. And there's very limited empirical evidence out here, and the poor policymakers are trying to do the right thing. They don't have budgets, they don't have testing labs, and you all can help in this effort. And I'm going to pass over now to Veronique, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about some of the research she's been leading to look at these risks and to help focus regulators' attention on areas of greatest risk to human health. So Vero, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if there's any issue with that. Oh, share screen. Okay, can you all see it well?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So before diving deeper into the topic of pesticide risk in West Africa, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge my collaborator to this study, Wayne Jain from Michigan State University, Amadou Diarra, who is an agronomist in Mali, Steve Aglet here from MSU, as well as Joseph Edmond from the Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana, Joseph Ipu from the University of Félix Poigny in Côte d'Ivoire, and Abdraman Traoré from the Preposam project in Mali. So as we just heard from Steve, West Africa has experienced rapid growth in pesticide use over the last decade and a half. And the initial growth has been largely driven by increased demand for low-cost generic herbicide. Now, a lot of people, including plant protection specialists, are being worried about a second wave in pesticide use, this time driven, as Steve mentioned earlier, by insect infestation. Think about the locusts in Eastern Africa earlier this year, as well as the fall armyworm in West Africa. So both insects can destroy crop and may worsen food insecurity in a region that already suffer from food insecurity. So the second wave, or the second surge in pesticide use, will be different, because this time it involves more toxic insecticide product. So farmers have been responding to those pest infestation by using more pesticide and using pesticides that are more toxic. So with weak enforcement and weak monitoring capacity, there's a lot of fear that the increased volume combined with mishandling as well as uncertain quality might pose really great risk to human health and the environment. So despite those potential risks, pesticides remain unmonitored, underreported, and really poorly understood by several key stakeholders in the region, including farmer, consumer, and policymaker. So here with this study, we're really aiming to bring new evidence on what are the most critical emerging pesticide risks, and where are the most vulnerable zones to those pesticide risks. So we're focusing the study on 3 countries in West Africa: Mali, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire. Together, they pretty much cover all agroecological zone as well as farming system, from the dry land up north in Mali to the west coast, or the west humid coastal coast of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. So most of the previous studies done on pesticide risk in those 3 countries and pretty much in the region have focused on the impact of banned pesticide. Think about the impact of DDT applied decades earlier. Here, we are interested in looking forward. So we want to know about which active ingredient currently being used by farmers pose the most serious risk for their community in the region. So just a brief overview here of the lit review in the region. As I mentioned, those studies have looked at the impact of pesticide now banned on consumer health, pesticide residue in food, mostly in horticultural product, because horticulture require the use of a lot of fungicide and insecticide to fight a wide array of pests, as well as direct consumption. A lot of studies have looked at the impact of poisoning through ingesting pesticide. There has been some on-farm risk analysis looking at exposure of cotton farmer when they are spraying their field. So they get exposed through their skin as well as through inhalation. Similarly, previous studies looking at the environmental impact have looked at the impact of those really highly toxic pesticides that have now been banned. So they're looking at pesticide runoff on surface and groundwater. So with this study, we want to keep that knowledge of what we have learned from the past, but we want to be looking forward and try to anticipate where are the risks. So we assemble 3 panels of experts, so 1 panel in each country, about 12 members per panel. So Each panel included toxicologists, chemists, pharmacists, agronomists, as well as representatives of the private sector or national cash crop companies. So each expert was asked to identify up to 10 pesticide products that she or he considered as posing risk for human health or the environment. So we were asking them to come up with up to 10 based on their own knowledge, as well as information from the World Health Organization on level of toxicity of different active ingredients. And we also share with them data on quantity of import and consumption in their own country. After that, we use that list of active ingredients, and we ask each group, each panel in each country to fill out a risk matrix. So we developed this risk matrix, as you can see on the slide, where we have the probability of exposure to the ingredient, as well as the severity if exposed to the active ingredient. So for the whole list of active ingredient that the group of panel came with, we asked them to score them from 0 to 5 in terms of probability of exposure. So here they will take into account the number of user quantity being used in the country. And for the severity, similarly on a scale from 0 to 5, what is the severity? And here they can take into account the level of toxicity from the WHO. And then when we do the multiplication of the probability times the severity, we get a risk score. And as you can see on the diagonal, the risk score goes from null to severe. And then as a third step, using that information from the risk matrix, we ask the panel of experts to identify hotspots for monitoring. So if we wanted to do a better job with monitoring, where should we be doing that in their own country? So now let's take a look at some of the results here for Mali. So in Mali, the group of experts came up with about 33 different active ingredients that they consider as posing to some extent some risk. And then when we look, you can see here in red, in those black cells, there are 3 active ingredients that are considered as posing severe risk to human health and the environment. So you can see the herbicide glyphosate, the insecticide chlorpyrifos, as well as carbosulfan. So glyphosate might not be the most toxic pesticide or active ingredient out there, but it is so widely used in Mali, and it is used without any protective equipment. So that's why the expert considered glyphosate to pose severe risk. And also, what is interesting here is the carbosulfan. Carbosulfan is not authorized for sale in Mali. Even though it's not authorized, we can find it on the market. So farmer can go in the market, buy it, and use it. So that's why it received an occasional score in terms of probability, and it's extremely high in terms of severity. And this is not the only active ingredient that it's banned, that it's available on the market. There are 3 others like that in Mali. So now let's take a look at Ivory Coast. The group of experts in Ivory Coast came out with about 40 different active ingredients. About 24 are insecticide, and 11 are fungicide, and 11 are herbicide. So as you can see here too, the herbicide glyphosate and D4D are considered to pose severe risk, and also the insecticide chlorpyrifos also show up in the severe category. So chlorpyrifos can have a negative impact on human health, especially it's very toxic if it's ingested. And also long-term exposure to this insecticide can lead to a negative impact on the reproduction system. So this insecticide as of now in Côte d'Ivoire is used on a wide range of crop, including cotton as well as horticultural products. Now let's take a look at the Ghana result from the panel of experts. As you can see, they came up with fewer key ingredients to start with, a dozen compared to over 30 in Mali and 40 in Côte d'Ivoire. And only one here show up as causing severe risk, and it's the herbicide paraquat. Interestingly, paraquat is not authorized for use in Mali and Côte d'Ivoire, but it is in Ghana. It is not authorized for use in the European Union, but it is widely used in the US. And as you can see, glyphosate and chlorpyrifos has been ranked as posing high risk to human health and the environment. So now, when we take a look at those three different matrices, what emerged is 3 active ingredients have been consistently and independently ranked as posing either high or severe risk to human health and the environment. And the first active ingredient is chlorpyrifos, the second glyphosate, and the third one paraquat. So chlorpyrifos is being used on the cotton crop in Mali and Côte d'Ivoire, as well as other cash crop in Côte d'Ivoire. In Ghana, chlorpyrifos is mostly used on horticultural crop. Here, it's worth noting that the main route of exposure to pesticide in these 3 countries, it's mostly through the skin and inhalation. The experts think that the risk of direct consumption poisoning is less likely than exposure through the skin and the respiratory tract. So chlorpyrifos, it's a widely used insecticide, and they're expecting demand for this product to continue to grow. It's getting more and more use on fruits and vegetables. So with that, there's a growing concern on pesticide residue on fruits and vegetables. Glyphosate. So glyphosate might be less toxic than the other 2 active ingredients that were identified. However, it is widely spread. Everyone uses it on all crops. So because of that, there's some risk associated, especially because they're using it without protective equipment. And as Steve mentioned earlier, there's a lot of issue with the quality. So we're not always sure on what they are putting on their field, which might have a negative impact on the environment and human health. And because it is the most widely used active ingredient, it would be a good one to look for tracking pesticide prevalence in food and water supply. And the third one, paraquat, as I mentioned, it is not authorized in Mali and Côte d'Ivoire because it is considered to be too toxic to human, although it is still being used in Ghana. This really highlights the issue of enforcement of regulation and harmonization across the region. So based on that information, so with the panel of experts, we have been able to identify priority in terms of key pesticide to monitor. So now the question is, where should we do that? Where should we monitor those active ingredients that are likely to be posing high to severe risk to human health and the environment? So each group came up with 3 what we consider hotspot for pesticide monitoring. So in Mali, the cotton production bassin, Office du Niger, where irrigated rice and horticultural products are being grown. Office de Begindea, where it's also irrigated rice, but sorry, not irrigated rice, but mostly horticultural products that are being then sold to the urban consumer in Bamako, close by. Likewise, in Côte d'Ivoire, the cotton production bassin, the cacao plantation, as well as the peri-urban area of Abidjan, where a lot of horticultural products are being grown for the urban consumer of Abidjan. In Ghana, Derma, Akomadan, and Bergoro are the region or the zone where most of the pesticides are being used in the country. So the experts are really worried about soil and water pollution, as well as poisoning for human, as well as livestock. So we are looking forward. So now we know the active ingredient that we need to pay more attention to. We know where we should be monitoring. So the next step will be to establish those monitoring sites. And when we ask the different group of expert recommendation, what are the next steps, they all came up with the next step, which is absolutely amazing. All independently, they have a good idea of what needs to be done. So we need to establish monitoring site. We need to improve the implementation and enforcement of regulation. We need to have more assessment of what works and what doesn't work to treat different forms of pesticide poisoning. We need to train farmers on when, how to use pesticide and how to dispose of them safely. And also there is a need to set up a toxicovigilance structure. By that, we mean a structure that will be able to identify and evaluate the risk related to pesticide use, and then being able to take action to quickly minimize those risks within a community. So on this note, I will stop here and I will be more than happy to answer any questions. Same for my colleague Steve, any feedback question for him or more than welcome. Thank you.